The Art and Science of Mead, all about filtration. Welcome to our series of educational videos dedicated to the craft of making mead. All about filtration, introduction, and overview. There are many methods of clarifying mead. Mead will clarify fairly well simply with time and patience. Cold crashing can help too. I find that works better though, closer to after fermentation is complete. There's still large particulate matter, yeast cells and other things that will fluctuate and settle out when the temperature is lowered. Later on though, if you still have a haze, cold crashing does not seem to be quite as effective. Racking carefully, transferring from one vessel to another, leaving the leaves behind without stirring them up, also helps clarify. Fining agents can be very effective. Long before I used filtration in my own meads, I was using fining agents with good effect. You can get your meads very, very clear using fining agents alone and without filtration. I have a whole another presentation about fining agents and how to use them to help clarify your mead and also do some other beneficial things. Of course, for some meads, time, patience, racking, and even fining agents by themselves may not be enough to completely clarify, and that's where filtration can be useful. My first best of show at the Mazer Cup in 2015 was a beautiful sparkling strawberry melomel. And even though it won best of show, that one was not filtered. It was very clear. I used fining agents to get it very clear, and obviously the judges thought it was okay enough to win best of show. My second best of show in 2017 was filtered, but I don't think that really played much of a role in it. I could have made it as good without filtering. It was obviously the flavor and all the other characteristics that the judges liked to give it that. And sometimes when you think your mead is fairly clear, when you look at it more closely up to a bright light, it's not brilliantly clear. Here's a mead after fining agents only, and it looked actually much more clear than this, but I put it into the light at a certain angle so you could see how much haze is still in it. I ran it through the filter and down to 0.2 microns, and you can see how much more clear it is after that. It's, from being a dull clear to brilliantly clear. If you're a commercial mead maker, it's important also to try to clarify your mead. Here's a bottle that I purchased in a bottle shop right off of the shelf. I won't say you where, and I won't tell you whose commercial mead this is, but it's very hazy. It had a bunch of sediment on the bottom. If you're a consumer thinking about buying a bottle that you've never had before, and you see something like this on the shelf, you might not, spend the 20 or 25 bucks for this bottle because of how it looks. Now, appearance isn't everything. You can have a beautifully looking mead that tastes mediocre or even awful, and I've judged meads like that where they look beautiful, and I thought, wow, this is going to be something, and then it turned out it really fell flat when it came to how it tasted. But on the other hand, when I see a commercial mead like this as a consumer, clarification is not that difficult, if you follow the proper steps. And if they did not take the care and attention to make their mead look beautiful, I only can wonder what other things they did not care about, such as how it tasted. So clarification is very important if you're thinking of becoming a commercial mead maker, or you already are a commercial mead maker. So why should you filter your mead? Well, it can help clarify your mead sooner than time or patience alone. It helps reduce sediment or dust from forming on the bottom of the bottle later. One thing that has been very annoying back before I knew how to use fining agents and filtration is I would have a mead that looked fairly clear, and I bottle it, and a few months later it has a bunch of sediment on the bottom. Now, that's not the end of the world. If you're just making it to share with your friends and family, you can decant it off of there. That's perfectly fine. Of course, if you transport that bottle, it's going to all be resuspended, and you'll have a hazy mead again. If you're a commercial mead maker, though, it's very important to have a visually appealing product on your shelves. Besides that one photo of that bottle I showed you, I've seen other bottles that had, literally a half-inch of sediment on the bottle, and these are commercial meads. It's going to be very hard to introduce new consumers to mead if you have something like that. Now, not all mead has to be brilliantly clear. Session strength meads, it's understood that because of how they're made and the time frame, that they can have a little bit of haze, and they're often going to be served maybe right out of your tasting room. But for most other meads, if you're a commercial mead maker, you really want them to be fairly clear in order to compete with some of the other products that are going to be on the shelves, such as wine. If you're a home mead maker who enters competitions like myself, a brilliantly clear entry can give you an edge over the competition. If the competition is tight, it can be difficult. I remember many times as a judge where we really struggled, who was going to get a medal and who wasn't, or even, which one is going to get the best of show and which wasn't. And if the entries are very, very close in everything else, in how they taste and their flavor and how they're put together, you might have to pick on something as, that's brilliantly clear compared to just bright. And so that's something that can really help you, give you an edge. It's not the most important part of winning medals, but it is one of the tools in your arsenal to try to win medals over your competitors. And for those who have access to sterile filtration, I'm talking about commercial mead makers, filtration done at time of bottling can minimize risk of in-bottle microbial activity later. So filtration is an advanced technique. It's something that if you are a new or intermediate mead maker, and maybe you're thinking of investing some money into into mead making, and you're thinking of investing in filtration, there's many other things I probably would spend my money on first. For example, if you don't have any ability to do lab testing for pH and sulfites, I definitely would invest in that before filtration. A kegging system with CO2, I would invest in that before filtration. Even just like fermentation vessels that offer temperature control, those are all very useful, and I would find them much more useful than filtration. Filtration is really something that you really want to take a step up, or maybe even you're thinking about becoming a meadery yourself, and you're wanting to learn how to do this more advanced technique. The most common types of filtration used by home mead makers are filter pads and cartridge type filters. I will be talking about some more advanced type of techniques that commercial meaderies may be interested in, but it's not an absolute necessity. This is a very useful tool, but it's not an absolutely necessary tool. And despite the myth that's online and in many of the social media groups, when done properly at the levels that both home and commercial mead makers utilize it, filtration does not remove flavor. People have some very strong opinions about that, but the science does not show that filtration removes it in any meaningful way. So this presentation will talk about some of the background, some of the concepts of filtration. It'll talk about types of filter media, some of the filtration systems available to both home and commercial mead makers. Some of them, like crossflow, probably most commercial mead makers will never be able to use this either, unless they're very lucky, or they're very big and they have they can afford it. Or maybe there's a mobile crossflow filtration unit. If you're in an area where there's a lot of wineries, you might have access to this. But most of us, even those that become commercial, will never be able to do that. But I want to still mention it just so that you can, be familiar with that term and what it means. Then I'll talk about the best practices for filtration. There can be problems with filtration. You can have difficult filtration situations, and so I'm going to review how to do that or how to avoid that, and then also cleaning and sanitation. And then finally, I'll address that controversy: does filtration remove flavor or color? Before I go any further, I have to mention this. I see on some of the social media forums a beginning mead maker trying to clarify their mead and maybe save money and by straining it through a coffee filter. Don't do that. Just don't do that. You're only going to take out some of the larger chunks. You're really not going to clarify your mead very much, if at all. And you run the very strong risk of oxidizing it. So just don't do that. And I've also seen folks ask, well, can I just go to the hardware store and get a water filter? I mean, the housing and all of that probably would be okay, but you don't want to use the actual filter cartridge designed for water, because these often have activated charcoal in them, and that's okay when you're trying to remove some off flavors, off aromas from the water. Maybe you've got some bad water and you want to make it, taste better. But if you put mead through that, it's going to take out all the good stuff too. So don't do that. Don't use coffee filters, and don't use home water filters for filtering your mead. If you have to even ask this or think about this, maybe you shouldn't even really be thinking about filtering at all, but try to, learn how to use fining agents more successfully and so on. Okay, well, let's talk about the background of filtration, some of the important concepts. And some of this is kind of academic and might not seem that useful, but it's important to understand it so that later on, when you're using your filter system and you're having some problems or you're trying to avoid problems, then you'll understand that. And also trying to choose from what type of filtration system should I use, or what type of filter cartridge should I choose. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the concepts of filtration now. I'm going to review particle size, the types of particles, particle deformability, the types of filtration that are available, what do filter ratings and porosity mean, and then some of the factors that affect the filterability, how easy a mead or wine is able to be filtered. Particle size. Most of this comes from a wonderful document by Zockline. It's open access. If you Google it, you can find it fairly easily. And so I encourage you to track down that document if you want to know more about all of these topics or concepts. So porosity, when we talk about the porosity of a filter, we're talking about the size of the particles, and we're measuring them in microns. It's about 39 millionths of an inch. And without a magnification, you can detect particles maybe 100 microns or larger. Bacteria yeast run from around 0.5 to 1.2, or maybe even up to 2 or 3 microns in size. The smaller the particle, the more difficult it is to remove, which kind of makes sense. Smaller particles are tinier, and they're more likely to flow through your filter media. Here's a representation showing relative sizes of yeast and bacteria to like a fine grain of sand or a red blood cell. So bacteria and yeast are itty bitty tiny things that they can be difficult to filter out unless you have the proper type of filtration system. Particles within a solution, a mead or wine, are distributed in a non-symmetrical fashion. What we mean is that there tends to be many more small particles than large particles. And I just said the smaller particles are more difficult to filter out than the large particles. Particles can be deformable versus non-deformable. Basically, think of the deformable particles as those that are soft and gelatinous or that can stretch. And even though a yeast may be larger than the rating that you have for your filter, you might need to use a smaller rating, a smaller porosity, a tighter filter to get that out, because the yeast cells can kind of stretch and shrink and kind of as they're passing through the filter media because of their elasticity. Some particles are non-deformable, such as crystals or diatomaceous earth. Here's a listing of some of the different types of particles in wine and mead. If there are a lot of deformable particles, they can sort of mat over the filter. They can cause clogging, make the filter more likely to clog and shorten its lifespan of use. So it may be wise to try to get rid of those deformable particles as much as possible, perhaps by using fining agents or by using a filter with larger porosity. Try to get those out before you go to your tighter filtration media that may be more expensive and maybe more likely to clog. Particle size and filterability. So larger particles are easier to remove from filtration than smaller particles, and over time, particles can adhere together through flocculation or even with fining agents, and so the larger particles are easier to remove by filtration than smaller particles, which is why we recommend pre-filtering with more coarse filtration or treating with fining agents first to increase filterability later. There's different types of filtration. What we're doing as mead makers is we're using macro and micro filtration. That is, we're using our filter pads and cartridges to remove microbes and larger suspended materials. but we're not doing ultrafiltration. We're not actively trying to remove pigments and tannins, polysaccharides. We're not using reverse osmosis. We might do that in our water. Our water source may have some problems, and so we might use a reverse osmosis water, which removes, practically everything. But that's one of the reasons why filtration at the levels we do as mead makers is not going to be taking out all the aroma and flavoring agents that we want to leave. And just looking at these from a different standpoint, with microfiltration removing particles, sediment, and so forth, ultrafiltration is tighter. Then you get to nanofiltration, and then finally, reverse osmosis that takes out practically everything except the water itself. Perpendicular versus cross-flow filtration. Well, most of us, both home mead makers and most commercial mead makers, are going to be using perpendicular. Basically, the fluid, the mead, goes straight through the filter media, with the filter media capturing, hopefully, the particles that we want to be out of that solution. But eventually, the problem with this is that the particles will build up, and there won't really be enough openings, and it'll slow down, and eventually the filter will be clogged and have to be disposed of. With cross-flow filtration, because the fluid, the mead is moving parallel to the filter media, it's almost self-cleaning. Not to say that you can't clog a cross-flow filter, but it's less likely to happen, and the filter media can be regenerated. There certainly are things that can clog cross-flow filters. A winery told me once about how one of their newer employees got some bentonite into their cross-flow filter, and that was a very expensive mistake. It basically clogged everything. But like I said, cross-flow filtration is a very expensive tool that only a few meaderies may have access to, or maybe be able to use like a unit that's portable that's going around to all the different wineries in the area. Well, let's talk about porosity and filter ratings. So porosity reflects the smallest particle size that'll be stopped by the filter. And some of the common ratings are 5, 3, 1, 0.45 microns. There is absolute rated filters and nominal. Absolute, basically the smallest particle that will be stopped 99.99% of the time. These are very useful if you're doing sterile filtration. But because they are so, they're absolute rated, they tend to be more expensive. Nominal rated filters are much more common, and they're rated as the smallest particle that will be stopped most of the time, but much less than 99.9%, often somewhere between 50 and 80% of the time. So you would never use a nominal rated filter, for example, to try to sterile filter a batch, because you're not going to be getting all the bacteria and yeast out of it. Some is going to get through. It's still very useful for filtering because nominal rated filters tend to be less expensive. So you may use those when the mead is still fairly hazy before you go to your more tighter rated and absolute rated filters. There's different levels of filtration, and different people have different opinions on where would you say coarse filtration versus polish filtration and so on. But in general, coarse filtration is very large particles greater than 5 microns. Whereas polish there's rough polish, medium polish, and then fine polish, which basically is a rating that is tight enough that it could almost be sterile filtration, but it's maybe not an absolute rated membrane filter, so it's still not technically sterile filtration. And then finally, if you have an absolute rated filter, you can do sterile filtration if it's less than 0.45 if it's 0.45 microns or less. I don't want to bore you with this. I hate formulas myself, so bear with me. This is helpful to sort of think about factors that improve filterability versus decrease filterability. So the filtering rate, the volume that can be filtered over a period of time, can be improved by certain things and can be decreased by certain things. So if there's a greater pressure difference across the filter, that will increase filterability. Obviously, there's limitations to that. If you have the pressure so great, it can actually start damaging the filter. If you have a membrane filter and it has too much pressure, you can actually damage it to where it loses integrity and it's no longer, an absolute rated filter anymore. Filter area also. So that's an important, probably even more for a commercial meadery, because they have to decide how much, how large do their filters need to be. The larger the filter area, the faster that you're able to filter, and the greater volume that you'll be able to filter before it's clogged. But you don't want to have too much filter capacity, because that maybe is wasting your money. And then factors that decrease filterability: the viscosity of the solution. A heavy, sweet sack mead is going to be more difficult to filter than, say, a dry mead or like a very light, session strength mead. Filtering resistance can also affect filterability, obviously. So a less tightly rated filter will be more easily or faster. It will have a higher filtering rate than compared to tighter rated filters, or say sterile filtration. And basically this is intuitive. The rate of filtration is increased by greater pressure difference and increased surface area, where it's decreased by increased viscosity and or increased resistance through the filter itself. Okay, enough on formulas. Let's now discuss some of the types of filter media that we have available. One concept to understand is the difference between depth filter media and surface filter media. So depth type filter media, the liquid being filtered, the mead or the wine, passes through the filter media and eventually gets stuck as it's going through. But because it can't really be quite as tightly rated, typically depth filtration is only nominal rather than absolute. It's less expensive than other filter media, and that's why it's very good as a pre-filtration before you start going to the more expensive surface or absolute filtration. It's good when you still have a relatively hazy mead when you're first starting to filter it, before moving up to some of the other filter media that may be more expensive. Then there's surface type filter media. Basically, there's a layer of filter media that captures all of the particles at the surface. And so often these can be rated absolute, and they can often have tighter ratings than depth filter media. The downside, though, is these particles can collect on the surface. They're not captured within the media itself, and as you imagine, it's more likely to clog that filter media as that happens, and they tend to be more expensive. And that's why this tends to be a better option later on in the filtering process. So after you've gotten the mead relatively clear through your depth filter media, then you can start using the tighter rated surface type media. And then one type of surface media is what we call membrane filter, which is absolute rated. And if they're small enough, they can be used as sterile filtration. These are the most expensive type of cartridge type filter media. And that's why they're best used as the final filtering right before bottling, after you've gotten the mead basically as clear as you want it through all of your other filter media. There's many types of filter media: diatomaceous earth, cellulose, fiberglass, nylon, PES, Pvdf. These are all options within the filter media, and what you choose may depend on what you're wanting to do. What you're planning on using the filter for. Most of our modern filter media are nonpolar and chemically inert. What I mean is they take out the bad stuff while leaving most of the good stuff. Diatomaceous earth has been used many years. It's inexpensive. It's often used with other filter media. For example, you might put some diatomaceous earth and then you use that, and it helps even increase the ability of your depth filtration to have more effectiveness. There is some risk of color and flavor loss, and it's sort of falling out of favor now, because there is some hazard. There is some risk if the dust is inhaled. I mean, these are basically silica skeletons, so think of microscopic little bits of glass skeletons. You don't want to get that into your lung. It can, especially if this happens repeatedly over a long period of time, it can cause some long-term health problems. Then there's cellulose. The older style had diatomaceous earth with it, but there was some risk of color loss. That's why we tend not to use the older forms of cellulose. But the newer forms have minimal color absorption. They have a longer life of use. They often do not require the sweetening with citric acid, as we often have done in order to minimize the paper taste you can get with some of the paper media. There's fiberglass. It's inexpensive. It's good for depth filtration, especially for hazy or hard to filter batches. Later on you're going to be using different types of filter media, but it's often used in some of the depth type cartridges that we use. Then there's nylon. So nylon is commonly used in some of the depth filter cartridges as well, and filter pads, but it does have a chance of adsorbing negatively charged particles, which could affect, especially in lightly colored meads and wines, because it might bind to anthocyanins. Then we have polyether sulfone. Because it does not hydrogen bond, it has practically zero color adsorption. It's often made in an asymmetric manner, and compared to nylon, it has better flow rate and capacity. It's often used in membrane filters as well. And then you have Pvdf, polyvinylidine fluoride. This, along with PES, are most commonly used for sterile filtration prior to bottling, and it has the lowest protein and color binding of any type of common membrane filter. Lower binding means it's less likely to plug and has better cleaning of proteins, but it has a slower flow rate compared to PES for the same surface area, so something to keep in mind. Well, now that you know about filter media, you have to put it in something. You can't, you have to have it, through some type of system in order to use it to filter your mead. And the filter systems I will be talking about, filter pads, such as those used in a plate and frame system, and filter cartridges. Those are most commonly used by home mead makers, and also there are commercial systems available for those. And then I'll talk about the two systems that are options for commercial mead makers, including lenticular as well as crossflow. Now, there are other topics in filtration and other types of filtration. I'm not going to cover them. If you need to know about them, or you're going to use them, then you know more about filtration than I do, and you can teach us all about that. But this is centrifuges and rotary vacuum drum filtration. Another topic I'm not really going to cover is you do need, for some of these filters, you do need to have a pump and some type of line or tubing to move the mead around, and then fittings so that you can attach that to the tank or to the pump itself. Some of the filtration systems comes with integrated pumps, which is really nice if you don't already own a pump, because you can disconnect it from in some of the systems you can disconnect that and use it as a pump for transferring mead. But the larger commercial systems assume that you'll already have a pump on hand, and you do need to make sure that whatever system you're going to purchase will also work with the type of filtration system that with the type of pump you have is going to work with the filtration system that you're about to purchase. So let's talk about the different types. So filter pads, commonly these are used in a plate and frame system. The pads are sandwiched within a frame. It's one of the more cost-effective systems. The depth filters are preformed into pads. Negatives, it does take longer to set up. There is some risk of loss through leakage. There's also a risk of oxidation. So you have to make sure the gaskets are tightly closed. And then many of them you have to avoid paper taste by first sweetening them by running through a cycle of a sulfite and citric acid solution. So some filter pad systems for homemade makers. There's this one. It's basically a very, very simple system where you're pushing your product through from one keg to another, using a little bit of carbon dioxide. This is not going to have very tight filtration, and it's not going to have a lot of capacity. You're not going to be able to do many, many gallons with this. And there is a risk of putting a little bit of carbonation into your mead that maybe you don't want that if you're wanting to keep it still. But it is very, very inexpensive. You get what you pay for, but it is inexpensive. So a step up. I know a lot of home mead makers have had good luck with the Buon Vino mini jet filter. It's designed for filtering about 5 to 10 gallons at a time, and it does have a little pump that comes with it. Another step up is the Superjet 3-plate. It's more expensive also, but it's designed for a more serious home or wine mead maker who's going to be filtering more than 10 gallons at a time. And then finally, they have the 6-plate Superjet filter for those who are filtering over 60 gallons at a time, and it filters at about 70 gallons per hour. But again, you know, you get what you pay for. It is a little bit more expensive. Now, they're available for commercial mead makers, and you know, as I go through and I show some of these examples, I'm not recommending a certain vendor, I'm not recommending a certain model or brand. I just put these up as examples for all of you. If you're going to invest in this as a meadery and planning or a commercial mead maker, you really need to, it really does pay to shop around and ask lots of questions and see, you know, where you can get the best deal that will also fit your needs. So a 20 by 20 centimeter 20-plate system is can be $1,200, and then a 20 by 20 plate filter with 40 plates has a little bit more filtration per hour, and it's a little bit more expensive than that. And then you can even go bigger to a 40 by 40 centimeter plate filter, 30 plate. And this one is like, you know, almost $6,000. So you can really spend money to get a system as a commercial meadery, but you really have to decide, you know, do I really need something this big? Can I get by with something a little bit less? One of the more complicated things is the setup of the plate and frame. You know, as you're putting the filter pads on, you have to make sure the rough side goes out and the smooth side in. You have to make sure that they're compressed together very tightly so that there's no leakage. And the larger, the more pads you have, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to get that to where it's tightly sealed, so you're not going to be having a lot of leakage. You know, so when you're thinking about purchasing a plate and frame system as a commercial meadery, you have to ask yourself, you know, how much volume do I want to filter in one filter run? You know, the pads in a plate and frame system are not reusable, so you don't want to have a lot of leftover capacity because you're just wasting money, even though the filter pads are not that expensive. So the cost is not that big of a deal. But what you also don't want is, you know, to have to stop partway through because you do not have enough capacity to take it all apart to put new filter pads on, because that's very time consuming and a real pain in the neck. So you want a system that's big enough for what you're going to use it for, but you know, not bigger than what you need. So you have to think about what volume do you want to run in a filter run. You know, a single 20 by 20 centimeter filter pad will filter about 10 or 15 gallons before clogging. And this is a rough estimate. I mean, if you have a very cloudy mead, it's not going to give you that much, of course. So a 10-plate 20 by 20 filter pad system should filter about 100 to 150 gallons, again, assuming this is not an extremely cloudy, hazy mead. A 40 by 40 centimeter pads, these filter about 4 times as much as a 20 by 20, so about 40 to 60 gallons per filter pad. So that means that a 10-plate 40 by 40 system will filter the same amount as a 40-plate 20 by 20 filter system. You know, and so you think about that, it's much more going to take more time to put 40 plates together for a filtering run as compared to only 10 plates. Another concept into thinking about a plate and frame system is, do you want to be able to do a double filtration? So usually when you're doing standard filtration, the product goes through from, you know, one filter pad, type of filter pad at a time. You can't mix and match. So if you have to do multiple levels of filtration, you're going to have to take it apart, take out the old filter pads, and then put new ones in, put it together, and then do another filter run. But if you have a plate that you put in there to create a diversion chamber so you can do double filtration, you can have 2 different types of filter pads that you can use during a single filter run, and that helps you save time because you don't have to take it apart to put in new pads. You can have 2 different pads in the same plate and frame system as you're doing a filtering run. And this is just a diagram to show you what a standard filtration looks like, where the product basically goes through the pads, as compared to a double filtration plate where there's a diversion plate that allows you to have more than one type of pad being used in a single filtering run. Okay, well, let's talk about another type of Filter cartridges. Basically, it's a cartridge and a filter housing. And these look fairly familiar. I mean, if we've looked at water filters and things like that we use in our homes, these are often cartridges in a filter housing as well. The cartridges we use are designed specifically for an alcoholic beverage, such as wine or mead. The nice thing is there's minimal risk of leakage and less risk of oxidation as compared to, say, a plate and frame system. Many types can be saved, so if it's not fully clogged, you don't have to throw it out. Unlike filter pads, which you use them, you can't save them for reusing later. If you put multiple housings in a row, you can sometimes do multiple levels of filtration, but the cartridges are a bit more expensive than filter pads. Some of the configurations, when you are thinking about what type of filtration system, you have to get the right type of cartridge to fit the right type of whatever type of filter cartridge system you have. And so there is DOE, double open end. Basically, it's open on both ends, and there's a rubber O-ring or gasket that presses tightly against the fitting on the each end of the housing. And then there's SOE, or single open end, where the cartridge is open only on one end. And so there's usually two O-rings, and it fits into a finely machined socket. And of the two designs, the SOE configuration is thought to be more secure and fail-safe, less likely to leak. If you're doing sterile filtration, it's going to be an SOE system and not a double open end. But some of the SOE cartridges can be more expensive than the double open end. So there's different other types of design, how these are constructed. And I was very confused by this when I first started filtering. What is the difference between, melt blown and spun bonded and pleated? And so this is what the difference is. So these melt blown and spun bonded, the fibers are blown or spun onto a spindle, and there may be less surface area, but because this creates a very complex pathway for the fluid and the particles to pass through it, these are very good for depth filtration and allows them to capture a large number of different sized particles. So these are less expensive, and they're very good for your first levels of filtration, your coarse filtration and some of the rough polish filtration. Then there are pleated designs, and these are surface type filters, but they're folded back and forth and back and forth. And these allow there to be a larger surface area as compared to simply like the melt blown filter. And with a surface type filter, that's a concern, is having a larger surface area so you can have more capacity. And so this is, because it's a surface filter, it's more effective when the particles are nearly all the same size. So if you've filtered out all the different particles as best you could with the depth filters, and now you move to these surface type filters. And thus they're best used after depth filtration, but before you do your stellar filtration. And most of us home mead makers are not going to be doing sterile filtration. That's something for commercial mead makers. So often this is what I finish with. I finish with a 0.45 or even 0.2 micron pleated design surface type filter, which, that's not absolute rated, so that's not going to be a sterile filtration, but it does make it beautifully crystal clear. And then finally, there are membrane surface type filters with Pvdf or PES. These are being used by commercial meaderies and wineries immediately prior to bottling. They do clog very easily, so your mead has to be brilliantly clear before you use that. But that's the benefit, is that you can use this to get a sterile filtration, so you're filtering out all the yeast and bacteria. Well, let's talk about some of the cartridge filter systems for home mead makers. There is this one. It's a 10-inch filter cartridge. It's put in line between two ball-lock kegs, and then it's pushed from one side to the other using inert gas. The gas that most of us are going to be using is probably going to be carbon dioxide. But if you put the pressure too high pushing it through, you might get some carbonation, which you might not want. And the level of filtration is not going to be that tight, maybe down to 1 micron. There's only so much, so tight of a filtration system that you can push using CO2 alone without actually having a filter pump. But it is relatively inexpensive, so it is something, if you don't really need to do the tighter filtrations that you're aiming for, it's something that's very inexpensive. Another system, the Enolomatic vacuum bottle filler, can be combined with an Enolomatic filtration system for a little bit more money, and these use single open-end cartridges, and you can filter while you're transferring or racking the mead, or you're filtering right into the bottle. There is also a commercial upgrade available for this as well. And here's an example of a cartridge filter system for a commercial mead maker. You can see there's 2 units, and these are 20-inch cartridges, and it can push roughly 240 gallons per hour. But the cost is a bit more, but this is for a commercial mead maker who's going to be doing more volume. And then finally, you can get the a membrane filter housing if you're a commercial mead maker for sterile filtration. These come able to be steam cleaned or cleaned with hot water. It's going to be having a pressure gauge and then butterfly valves to put it onto your onto the lines to go from whatever tank you're pulling your product from into your bottling line. That brings us to another type of filtration system that is an option for commercial meaderies, lenticular. Basically, these are the same filter media as filter pads. They look like a cartridge, but they're actually the same media as filter pads, but they're set up as modules, and the modules are most commonly available in either 12-inch or 16-inch modules, and they can be stacked on each other. So you can have 1, 2, 3, and then they have a housing. One of the benefits is because most of it's vertical, there's not a lot of space that's going to take up in your meadery. Because it's completely sealed, you're not going to be losing a lot of product. There's not any risk of leakage like with a plate and frame. There's minimal risk of oxidation as well as compared to a plate and frame. The media costs are much higher than filter pads, but many of these are reusable, and so if you store them, clean them and store them properly, you will end up saving time in the long run, and so that they can be very useful if you're reusing them. Some of them are back flushable. And most of them can be stored in a storage solution between filter runs. Here's an example of a 2-module, 12-inch lenticular housing. And again, I'm not recommending this product over another or this vendor. I'm just putting these all here as examples just to know what's out there. And if you're using a 2-model 12-inch lenticular housing, that has an equivalent filtration surface area as a 40 by 40 plate and frame that has 24 pads. So you're going to save a lot of space on this because of how it's made. And then that brings us to cross-flow filtration. I'm not going to talk much about this because this is beyond the ability for most meaderies are pretty small, and so you're not going to be able to afford cross-flow systems. But some of you might be lucky. You might be in an area where there's a lot of other alcohol-related businesses or wineries, and there can be mobile filtration units. Or who knows, you may go big and you may be a large enough of a commercial meadery someday that you could afford one of these systems. As I kind of mentioned, it's a surface type filtration, but because it goes parallel rather than perpendicular, there's less risk of clogging. It tends to be self-cleaning. And even though it can filter down to 0.2 microns, it cannot be absolute rated. You cannot use it for sterile filtration, and that's because you cannot perform integrity testing on it, so therefore you can't rely on it to perform a true sterile filtration. There are a lot of benefits with cross-flow filtration. I mentioned the lower chance of clogging. You can pass through like a very hazy mead on one end, and then it can come out like just brilliantly clear. Low loss of product, minimal exposure to oxygen. The cost is medium to high, and you can't do sterile filtration. And the negatives, the initial cost of a cross-flow system is very high. So a small introductory system may be $25,000, $30,000, and for a larger system, it's up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It does require some training, and you can ruin the media if you do things like try to put bentonite through it, or you have a product that has a lot of colloid and things like that. It can be very hard to clean that out of the system. But hey, if you have a lot of money and you win the lottery and you want to, this would be the Cadillac of filtration systems for meaderies and wineries. So when you're trying to think of what type of filtration system will best fill my needs, you need to think about the following. And this actually applies to home mead makers as well as commercial mead makers. What volumes will you be filtering? How many gallons are you going to expect to go through? You don't want to have to stop halfway to take apart your filter to put new pads in, ideally, because that's going to be a waste of time. What is your time worth? As a home mead maker, you're only doing small volumes, so it's probably not that important. But if you're doing it, for a living or as a business, these are important questions. How much are you willing to spend? Some of the more expensive systems do give you more capacity, but is that something that you can afford right now? Is the system expandable, as the lenticular systems are? How much are you willing to spend on the system itself and then on the filter media? Do you want reusable filter media? Those may be more expensive in the beginning, but if you get to reuse them several times, they may actually save you money, over the long run. Is space an issue? Like I mentioned, plate and frame is probably the least expensive type of filtration system, but it does take up a lot of space. Lenticular filtration in a meadery may make more sense if you're really trying to maximize, how much space or how little space you're using with your equipment. And then, do you want the option for absolute sterile filtration? You would have to get a separate housing to use, for your membrane filtration. So, no matter what, if you're using a plate and frame or lenticular, you would have to have a separate housing for your membrane filters to do absolute sterile filtration before bottling. For most commercial meaderies, the choice is really going to be between plate and frame versus lenticular, and this is basically showing the different the diagram contrasting them. The plate and frame, the media is inexpensive. It's the least expensive there is. The systems tend to be less expensive also, but it takes a lot of time to set up and clean. It's more complicated. More training is required. There's greater chances of leakage and contamination and oxidation. Whereas the lenticular, it has a more expensive filter media, but that's kind of can be a positive because it's reusable. It's very easy to use and set up and clean, less complex, and there's a less risk of contamination, and oxidation and leakage. And these are just costs that I took off the internet, so I'm sure if you can find different costs, but just to kind of give you a comparison. Now, of course, if you're doing a filtration with a filter pad, you're not going to just use one filter pad. You're going to have 10 of them or 20 or even more than that. But they're disposable, so that's a cost that's going to happen every time you do a filter run. Cartridges are a little bit more, but not a lot more, until you start getting into the more tightly rated membrane filters. Those can be very expensive, but those are going to be the last that you use in your filtering run. Lenticular filter modules are also more expensive, but they can be used multiple times. And then crossflow, this is an estimate, but that's something that this can be used many, many times because it's self-cleaning. And this is again, I'm not recommending this versus any other, but this is kind of just to give you a general idea of how many gallons that you may be able to filter using some of these different filter modules. A 12-inch lenticular filter module versus a 16-inch versus some other grades that they have available. And with each pass, you're going to get less ability before you finally, run out of, and finally have to get a new module. Well, let's review some of the best practices for filtration. Sometimes filtering can go awry and you can have some problems. The filter cartridges clog or something happens. And so I'm going to talk about some of the best practices prior to filtration and how to optimize your filtration. I'll cover integrity testing of membrane filters, talk about cleaning of your cartridges and filtration equipment, and then how to store them so that you can reuse them later. Well, here's some examples of problem filtrations. Your filter pads or cartridges clog when filtering. Despite filtering the mead, it becomes hazy afterwards, and dust develops in the bottle later, even though you'd filtered it. There's maybe excessive oxygen exposure during the filtration process and you have oxidation issues. Or you did sterile filtration hoping that you were going to eliminate, all of the microbia within your product, and then it starts fermenting again later. Somehow something got in there. Well, let's talk about minimizing clogging of filters. For one, don't try to run through an excessively hazy or cloudy mead. It's going to cost time, money, and frustration. Believe me, I've tried to do this. It's not going to work. And so you should try to clarify your mead as much as possible before filtration. So just because you have a filter doesn't mean that you're not going to be using fining agents. It doesn't mean that you're not going to rack out of your vessel. Don't try to filter like off of when there's a lot of leaves, because you might actually get some of that into your filter system, and it'll clog it immediately, depending what type of filter you're using. So try to clarify the mead as much as possible before you do a filtering run. If you're to make sure you don't have other types of hazes, perform stability testing before filtration. I talk about this in some of the other presentations I do, and because the filtration will not filter out other things that can cause haze, such as proteins. They're far too small. And so later on, you can filter a mead, you can put it in the bottle, it looks brilliantly clear, but later on a protein haze can develop, and it can develop dust or sediment, even though you filtered that mead. And so there are ways to manage that through fining agents such as bentonite, and there are stability testing that you can do to make sure that you're not going to have to worry about any issues with protein haze later on. And those are in other presentations. But it's important to do that before filtration, because if you have any issues with that, then you probably need to take care of them so that they're not going to be an issue later on. Always start with rough filtration first, more coarse filtration before moving to tighter ratings. And there are certain compounds that can clog filters easily. I mentioned bentonite, but other things like some of the polysaccharides, pectin, gum arabic. So try to use enzymes and fining agents. And again, try to use more coarse filtration first with rough depth filtration before you move towards tighter ratings. So try to minimize risk of infection. You can have this coming from the equipment itself if you had not cleaned and sanitized it. So make sure there's enough sulfite within your product itself, and sorbate if it's a sweet mead. Clean and sanitize your equipment before and every use. I do have a presentation that goes into much more detail about cleaning and sanitation. If you're going to reuse cartridges, clean and store them as per the manufacturer's recommendations. Do not try to filter at pressures higher than recommended. You might damage your filter media and start pushing things through. In general, when the pressure is greater than 30 to 40 psi, it's time to change the filter. Different filter media have different recommendations of this, however, so follow the manufacturer's recommendations. It may not actually be that great of a difference before you need to consider that filter clogged, and either it needs to be backflushed if that filter media allows it, or if it's a disposable filter media that needs to be thrown away, and you need to start using some new filters. Perform integrity testing of membrane filters to confirm that they are going to perform sterile filtration successfully. And if you still get infections happening, especially with membrane filters, you might want to collect samples from different parts of your filtering line to see where they may be coming. I've heard stories about there was a certain valve that was contaminated. It wasn't getting cleaned until they took it out and took it apart and truly cleaned and sanitized it. So if you're a commercial meadery and you're getting infections despite you're using membrane filtration and it did pass the integrity testing, you need to start thinking, well, where else, what source could there be? If my filter is working properly, what could the source be in my filter line that's contaminating it? There's risk of oxygen exposure, so try to avoid oxygen exposure every step of the process. You make sure your mead has acceptable sulfites to protect it, and then it's a good idea to purge your filter lines, vessels, equipment, and so on with either carbon dioxide or another inert gas such as nitrogen. Integrity testing of membrane filters. Basically, as a commercial meadery, you're going to be using these to prevent bacteria and yeast from getting into your product and in the bottle and causing problems later on. But you got to make sure that the membrane filters are still working, that they're not leaking and they're not damaged. There's three common methods of doing this: bubble point testing, pressure hold testing, and diffusion testing. I'm only going to really talk about the first two because they're more commonly done. You need a very highly accurate gauge to do diffusion testing properly, so just know that that's an option too. So if you're going to be doing integrity testing of your membrane filters, you can certainly look it up and see what all these, but I'm going to just talk about the first two. Bubble point testing, that's probably the more common integrity testing of membrane filters. Basically, the pressure of the gas overcomes the surface tension of the water, and then gas is able to pass through the membrane. Eventually, there's a steady stream of bubbles, and when that happens, that pressure that happens at is called the bubble point. And basically, it depends what the bubble point is. Depends on the rating of the filter and also the filter itself. It can differ depending on manufacturer. In general, 0.25 microns is around 20.3 psi, and 0.45 microns is around 26 psi. But different manufacturers have different cutoffs. This is from Gusmer Enterprises, and it shows the 0.65 micron has bubble point at 14.2. So there can be differences between different types of membrane cartridges and what the manufacturer is. So, always follow what the manufacturer says. Pressure hold testing is simpler. It's not quite as accurate, but basically you pressurize it to roughly about 80% of the bubble point and then the gas is turned off. And then you look, is there a drop, say in 2 psi within a few minutes, then the test has failed. But this is not quite as accurate. This is less than using the bubble point testing or the diffusion testing. Now, just because your membrane filter has failed in integrity testing, it does not mean that the membrane filter, has a leak or a hole in it. There's a lot of other reasons for it, and one of the more common ones is the filter was not fully wetted. And if there's an area where there's air, it's not fully wetted, then the air is just going to go right through that. So basically, if you fail integrity testing, re-wet and test again, just to make sure that that's not what the issue was. Other problems is maybe there's some damage to the O-rings of the filter. Maybe the filter housing O-ring is damaged or missed, or maybe you have a hardware leak somewhere else, in the gasket or valves or something. And if it's a brand new filter and it fails this, despite looking at all those things, contact the manufacturer, because if brand new, obviously it should be ready to use and not have any failure or anything like that. So some filters will allow you to clean and reuse them, but not all of them. Filter pads, of course, cannot be, and they have to be disposed. When you are going to be cleaning and reusing a filter, make sure the water you use is also clean. Just tap water straight from the tap. There's a lot of stuff in there and particles, so you need to be actually having a system to pre-filter the water that you're going to be using as part of your cleaning solution or rinse. And also remember that proteins begin to degrade. They literally begin cooking at around 135 degrees Fahrenheit. And when that happens, they can sort of mat on and get cooked onto your filter media. So you never want to start with hot water. First, if you're doing a rinse, you need to rinse first with cool water, followed by warm water, but not extremely hot water until later. Homemade makers have, there's one option is this. This is suggested by More Wine. You first rinse with cool water. Then run through a warm solution of Pvdf. Again, make sure the cartridges say they can be cleaned this way. Some of them are disposable and you can't clean them in any way. But the Pvdf helps degrade proteins and other things. Although it works at cooler solutions, it's more effective using a warm solution. And run it through, circulate it through for about 30 minutes or so. And after you're done, then follow it with a rinse of hot water until the solution is coming out no longer soapy or slippery, so that most of the Pvdf has been rinsed out. And then to deactivate any Pvdf that may still be there, and also to sanitize it, you follow it with an acid rinse, which can either be SaniClean or a citric acid sulfite solution. Commercial meaderies, however, they have some other options. Some of the filtration media they're going to use can be regenerated. They can be forward flushed, and some of them can be forward flushed followed by back flushed. Some can only be forward flushed, so again, follow directions. They can be rinsed with very hot water, but always start with cold and warm water first because the cooking of the proteins and getting them stuck on there. So always first rinse with cold and warm water until it's rinsing well, and then it can be sanitized with very hot water, or some of them even can be steam cleaned. And then commercial meaderies also have other cleaning and sanitizing agents such as periacetic acid that we just don't have available as home mead makers. The reusable filter cartridges can be stored after cleaning if they're not completely clogged and used up. So you have to read what the brand of filters are to see if that's even an option. You should remove from the housing. Remove O-rings because they can degrade in a highly acidic solution. And then you can store it either in a food-grade plastic bucket, or some of us use a PVC pipe cut with one end sealed and the other end removable. Here's my PVC pipes that I use for my filter cartridges. And you can store them either in a sulfite citric acid solution, or you can put it in ethanol, cheap vodka. I once got a whole shopping cart full of the cheapest vodka at a liquor store, and they kind of looked at me like, "Oh, you're gonna make some punch?" And then I'm like, "No, I'm using this to store my filter modules," and they kind of were like, "Huh?" Well, finally, that brings us to the question of, does filtration remove color or flavor? Emily Pinaud, probably one of the greatest enologists of all time, said, "The mechanical action of filtering has never had a negative influence on the quality of wine." Despite that, there's many winemakers and even some consumers that think that filtration, especially very tight filtration, can strip the aroma and color. And for this reason, many have avoided the use of tightly rated filters in wine production. And there's some wineries out there marketing the product as unfiltered wine, as if that's a positive attribute. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is most of our modern day filters are relatively inert. And although they may have some effects, I mean, they're supposed to remove particulate matter and things like that, although they may have some effects, it's not going to be dramatic or meaningful effects. The filter media is nonpolar, and so there's minimal removal of color from the wines being filtered. And most of the good stuff that we want that gives us the flavor and aroma, those compounds are far too small to remove from filtering alone. I mean, unless you're doing ultrafiltration or reverse osmosis or something like that, but that's not what we're talking about. This study by Boyer shows what the effects are upon color in a 2012 Malbec, and it shows there are some very slight changes, but not any changes with filtration as to be meaningful that you could actually detect that while you're sitting there enjoying that glass. Here's another study that was done through UC Davis, looking at membrane filtration on sensory and chemical properties of red wine. They had multiple different types of wine, but this kind of shows you of what they did. First, they had a control without filtration. They had another group that was filtered, but quote unquote filtered, but it went through an empty housing, so no filtration occurred, and they did it 3 times. Then they did one with a 0.45 micron Pvdf membrane filter. They did that three times. And then finally they did it with a 0.45 micron PES membrane filter. And then they looked at it. They analyzed it 0 weeks, week 3, 5, 7, 9, and so on. And basically there was no significant difference in color, hue, or intensity. So this very tight membrane filter did membrane filtration that was done multiple times, did not have any significant effect upon the color of the red wine. Well, then they looked at the sensory attributes, and there was no significant difference in how the wine smelled or tasted related to any of the filtration that was done as compared to the control that was not filtered. And there was also no significant effect in tannins related to filtration. Another study by the Australian Wine Research Institute looked at the effects of filtration on wine texture and macromolecules, and these were also red wines. They were looking at cross-flow and lenticular filtration, 0.65 membrane, 0.45 membrane, and they were looking at PES versus nylon membranes. So the particle size decreased significantly, which makes sense because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to filter particles out of. That's the point of filtering. We're trying to remove particles out of the wine. And even though that happened, the tannin and color remained unchanged. So the appearance of it, as well as the effects of tannin, would not be expected to change through filtration. And then they looked at it, the different wines, and there was the sensory analysis, so the aroma and flavor, and there really was no consistent related trends across all the wines. There were some subtle attributes in some of the filtration grain within wine, but basically the ultimate conclusion was the filtration has no impact upon wine color and only minimal impact on sensory profiles of red wine. The one thing I want to point out too is just because there is a change and just because it can be measured, in the real world, it doesn't mean that it's meaningful. Measurable and having a measurable difference in a statistically significant way, it could be so small, as to be not meaningful. Unless you're sitting there drinking the wine side by side, you wouldn't even notice it. And so Ribeiro Gaillon, in the classic Handbook of Enology, said, filtration is intended to eliminate turbidity, foreign bodies, impurities that would form lees, and they suggested it would be ridiculous to suggest that these substances are good to have in your wine. And they also stated that clear wine always tastes better than the same wine of even slight turbidity. This is something that I've always felt too. I always thought my mead tastes better after I filtered it. And I did not do, a triangle test, a blinded testing, so I don't know that for sure. I completely admit it may simply be my own bias. It looks better, so then it tastes better, even if I'm doing that on a subconscious level. But, most of these studies done scientifically in a blinded fashion do not show any significant effect upon color or flavor of wine, and it would not be expected to do any negative effect in the same way in regards to filtration of mead. So finally, that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation about filtration. Follow best practices of filtration to avoid frustration and to save money and time, to improve filterability and to not clog your filter media prematurely. Use fining agents, try to get your mead as clear as possible, and then start with depth filters, which have greater capacity than surface filters and are usually less expensive, before moving to surface filtration that is tighter and can do much more tighter ratings and have but do not have quite as much capacity. So that way you can save money. Instead of just trying to start with the tighter rated filters first and then simply clogging them. For home mead makers, we're going to be having to choose between filter pads, plate and frame, or filter cartridges. There are options for commercial meaderies to use these type of filter media, and then some additional options for commercial meaderies might include lenticular or crossflow. But like I said, crossflow is really the ultimate, and there's probably very few commercial meaderies that are going to be able to have that as a viable option. But I did want to explain it so that you're familiar with it, just so that if you hear this being talked about in conferences or you're visiting a winery or talking with a winemaker, you kind of have an idea what they're talking about. And then for some commercial meaderies, you can do absolute rated membrane filtration for sterile filtration. Although even that, I know most commercial meaderies that I use, they're using sulfate and sorbate to keep their product shelf stable. So that even that's not an absolutely necessary thing. Always perform integrity testing of your membrane filters if you're going to do that to make sure they actually are integral and they actually are going to successfully sterile filter your product. Some filter media can be stored and reused, so that's something to consider. Even though that media may have a higher upfront cost, if it's reusable, that may actually save you money over a longer time. And then clean and sanitize both your equipment as well as your filter media as per the manufacturer's recommendations. And finally, filtration does not remove color or flavor. at least not at the levels of filtration that we use as home and commercial mead makers. And if there are any differences, they're not enough to be meaningful. Well, that concludes this presentation all about filtration. I hope that you find the information helpful. A lot of this is information that maybe is not what you might need to know as a starting out home mead maker, but if you want to take your mead making to another level, and most certainly if you're a meadery in planning or you are on your way to becoming a commercial mead maker, filtration is something that is extremely helpful and useful and valuable when you're making a product commercially for sale to consumers. Thank you again, and I hope you find all of these presentations helpful. Thank you.